Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our next panel. Thanks for joining us again for this one. I'm Kristi Del Vecchio. I'm one of CEGU's graduate student research mentors this year, which basically just means I've had the great privilege of getting to work with a number of these students as their projects developed and were refined throughout the year. So pleasure to be here. I'll be introducing and moderating the panel, which is called Connections of Extraction and Waste. So without further ado, I think I'll just introduce all of the panelists in the order that they're presenting. Is that make sense? Okay, great. So the first, we have Laura Gersony, whose thesis is titled Rational Risk-Taking or Atmospheric Theater, Understanding Atmospheric Modification Decision-Making. Second, we have Zoe Saldinger, whose thesis is titled Grave Dispositions, Implementing Alternative Methods of Burial in the United States of America. Third, we have Joe Geniesse, whose thesis is titled Visualizing the Acceleration of Rare Earth Elements Mining in Kachin, Myanmar, a Polyspectral Spatial Database. And fourth, we have Meghan Hendrix, whose thesis is called Oil Change, Evaluating Fossil Fuel Divestment Campaigns and Commitments at U.S. Higher Education Institutions. Great, so let's go ahead and welcome Laura up for her presentation.
Test here? Okay. Oh, should I go ahead and before I start, I just want to thank my thesis advisor, Evan Carver. If there's anything in this presentation that you think is bad or wrong, he accepts all liability. Gonna get a timer out here. Okay. Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming. I'm Laura, and my research focuses on weather modification. By now, you've probably seen this chart in the press or in your reading. It shows humanity's progress towards mitigating global climate change. And as you can see, our current policies do not appear to be meeting the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, as spelled out in the Paris Agreement. As a result, there's growing interest in technologies that would artificially modify the weather in order to mitigate the impacts of climate change, and these technologies are known as geoengineering. Just to give you an example, one form of geoengineering would have humanity basically simulate a volcanic eruption. We would inject tons and tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere in order to deflect sunlight and keep the Earth cool below. It's pretty easy to imagine all of the technological and safety-related reasons why these proposals could go wrong, but there's also no shortage of speculation in the media and among academics about the political and governance risks associated with these technologies. At the moment, the jury seems to be out on whether we'd be looking at business as usual or the spark to World War III. It's pretty hard to imagine or to get a sense of how plausible this speculation is, chiefly because geoengineering has never happened before at this scale. So these debates are largely theoretical. What interests me about geoengineering and weather modification more generally is that it makes the atmosphere political. It pulls what is previously thought of as the quintessentially natural domain into the realm of political debate, responsibility, and even blame. Currently, presidential approval ratings tend to rise following a natural disaster, but it's not difficult, at least for me, to imagine a world in which the reverse is true, and people are, in a heavily engineered atmosphere, politicians are blamed for disasters that happen on their watch. But again, this is all speculation, and indeed the academic literature remains highly theoretical. I believe there's a technology that has been relatively understudied in the literature, but that I think provides a starting point for empirical studies of this question. And that technology is cloud seeding. Cloud seeding is a weather modification technology principally used to increase rain or snowfall. It works by spraying dust into rain or snow clouds, either from an airplane, as you see here, or through ground-based cannons injecting the dust from below. I think this technology is worthy of our attention really for three main reasons. The first is that it's already been practiced across the world for about 50 or 60 years at various levels of governance, so local, subnational, and national. And so there's already a robust data set for us to work with, so to speak. The second reason is that it might be the closest material analog that we have to many forms of geoengineering. In all of these cases, often we're spraying dust into the clouds. The effects are fairly diffuse, and it's hard to know whether or not it's working. And the third reason, and what to me is most interesting about this technology and why I feel it's worthy of our attention, is that it's really hard to know whether or not it's working. And specifically, it's hard to scientifically prove that to a degree of statistical significance. This is both because of measurement errors. It's harder than you might think to track water as it goes through the atmospheric water cycle. But it's also just because there's a lot of randomness built into the atmosphere. In one of the cases I study, cloud seeding would have had to change precipitation levels by close to 70% in order to get a statistically significant difference, which is a huge margin. So the curious result of this fact is that the field of cloud seeding and weather modification has stayed for basically its entire history in a state of ambiguity. And so we have headlines from 1988 here in the Washington Post that there's still debate as to whether cloud seeding amounts to science or snake oil. And then quite a similar headline in 2021 here from Politico. There's little evidence to show that the process is actually increasing precipitation. So what can we learn from this history? After spending about a year familiarizing myself with the technology and its history, this is a pattern that I would argue best equips us to understand decision-making regarding weather modification, and that is that it exists along a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, you have what I think of as rational risk-taking. You can imagine that even if you aren't sure whether or not a technology works, it still makes sense sometimes to gamble on it if the benefits are sufficiently high and the cost sufficiently low. So I define this as a case in which decision-making is consistent with available scientific and economic knowledge. At the other side of the spectrum, we have what I term atmospheric theater. That's coined, and it was inspired by the concept of security theater, coined after 9/11 to describe measures that in this context made Americans feel safe without actually making us more safe. And so likewise, I define the atmospheric theater as decision-making that provides the feeling of an improved environmental outcome while doing little or nothing to achieve it. And I just want to sidebar here that political performativity in itself is not a bad thing. In fact, a lot of us value our leaders being theatrical in a sense and keeping us informed about their decisions. That's why I keep this definition relatively narrow to forms of decision-making that are inconsistent with the scientific and economic evidence, just to clarify. So in order to do this, in my research, I looked at 4 case studies that, in my view, prove that this spectrum exists. On one end, we have the state of Utah from the year 2000 until present. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have Venezuela in 2009. In this presentation, just for the sake of time, I'm unfortunately not going to have quite as much time as I'd like to describe these 2 intermediary cases. But if you're interested, I do include them in my thesis just to illustrate how my framework would comprehend cases that are not quite so clear, and also to show how they would evaluate cases of cloud seeding as they unfold, while, for example, you still have the chance to vote on them rather than just in retrospect. So The first case study brings us to Venezuela in 2009. You may recall Hugo Chavez is president at this time, and the 1998 watershed election that propelled him into office is at this point more than a decade behind him. So he's gone from the fiery revolutionary to a political incumbent. And you'll recall that this is also a pretty shaky time for global leaders, around the world. On the heels of the 2008 financial crisis, there's our markets are still kind of unruly, and in Venezuela, this manifests as a pretty steep crash in oil prices at the beginning of 2009. And recall that this is after 5 years of pretty solid economic growth. So in June of 2009, we can imagine Hugo Chavez's dismay when in this period of instability, a drought hits, and it's a particularly nasty bout of the El Nino Southern Oscillation. There are water shortages, rolling blackouts, and importantly, protests blame, or I should say some protesters start to blame Chavez, and they articulate his socialist project as the driver of the drought. They blame him for not upgrading infrastructures during the time of abundance. And they also note the government's decision to freeze electricity rates as something that's contributing to rolling blackouts and failing to curb demand as is needed. So Chavez needs a solution in which he can convince his electorate that he's responsive to the drought while keeping his socialist, 21st century socialist vision intact. And he finds that solution in Cuban cloud seeding technology. The Cubans developed cloud seeding in partnership with then the USSR. And so he holds this press conference. You can see it pictured here. Chavez will bombard the clouds to create rain and confront the drought. I also, just as a funny added detail, at this press conference, he hosts the families of 5 Cubans who were convicted of spying in the US. So clearly this project has, a geopolitical dimension and certainly a political one. One shortcoming of doing this kind of retrospective research is that we can't be in those decision rooms. We can't know, maybe Chavez had access to world-class science that no one else in the world knew, and had this expert plan where he knew that cloud seeding was the most effective technology. Unfortunately, we don't have access to that kind of information, but we do have reason to believe that that was not the case, and that in fact this decision went contrary to available scientific evidence. The first reason is that just 6 years before, the US National Research Council had come out with a report that said that the use of cloud seeding on a large scale was premature. It said there was really no good evidence to show that it worked. And the second, couple of data points that we have are that the Chavez administration made a bunch of exaggerated claims about cloud seeding's efficacy during the rainy season when this program was ongoing. At one point they claimed, sorry, I'm out of breath, kind of a nervous public speaker. But at one point, they claimed that it was single-handedly responsible for a bout of rainfall when that is beyond cloud seeding's capabilities. At another point, they claimed it had elevated cloud seeding levels by 50%, which again is not even claimed by the rosiest proponents of cloud seeding. So in sum, I think we can pretty squarely diagnose this as a case of atmospheric theater. And again, that's a circumstance in which decision-making is not consistent with the available scientific and economic evidence. But it creates a feeling of an improved environmental outcome. Okay. Next up, we can go to the opposite end of the spectrum with the case of the state of Utah. Now, this looks very different and probably much more familiar to us bureaucrats here in the US. Like in many other US states, modern cloud seeding began in the 1970s. And from the very start, it was mediated through Utah's bureaucracy. Specifically, it's the Utah Water Resources Board that was given jurisdiction over cloud seeding. Those are appointed positions by the governor, but they are not subject to direct elective pressures. There are a couple reasons why I think we should believe that their decision-making has been consistent with the scientific evidence. The first reason is that the general science for snowfall seeding has generally been one step ahead of rainfall seeding throughout its history in the literature. But in addition, they have 30 years worth of empirical field study data, which suggests that cloud seeding produces really, really cheap water for them. The most recent estimate pegged this number at about $2.18. Even if that figure is off by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, it's still really, really cheap. And indeed, the state recently authorized even more money to go to this program's build out. Another data point that I think we should consider, that even if you aren't convinced by now that this is a case of rational risk taking, we see that actually private companies, and specifically ski companies in Utah, behave similarly. Now, of course, they don't share the public interest goal of increasing the water levels in the Colorado River Basin, but they do share the goal of making sure that they have fluffy snowpacks for people's expensive ski vacations. And so the fact that private companies are behaving similarly in this region, to me, adds to my confidence that this is a case of rational risk taking. I just want to check how much time I have. I think I'm not going to have time to go into these in depth. But just to mention, if you're interested, for the case of Kansas, it's kind of a natural experiment in which cloud seeding was practiced for a really long time in Southwest Kansas for quite a while. Then when it expanded into Northwest Kansas, the farmers in Northwest Kansas rebelled and formed this grassroots groups, Citizens Against Weather Modification. I think that based on this experiment is sort of, you can read again more in my thesis, but I think because the administration and the science available were basically identical, we have good reason to believe that there's something theatrical going on here, whether it's in Southwest or Northwest Kansas. And then finally, this is an ongoing case in Orange County, California. And in this case, really, in my view, the main takeaway is that several of the water board members have been campaigning on the issue of cloud seeding, and including it in their campaign materials. So this sort of raises the question of, are they just doing it to be performative? In my view, they are not. They're actually taking quite a slow and cautious approach through evidence-based field studies. And so that's why I classify this ongoing case so far as an instance of rational risk taking. So a couple key takeaways from my research. First, I think it's misguided to dismiss all weather modification decision-making as pathological, as one historian of weather modification did in 2009. At the same time, I really think we should take seriously the possibility that in a world with more weather modification and with more geoengineering, we might be seeing a lot more atmospheric theater in which the atmosphere itself is turned into a political football. A couple limitations. First, I deal only with local, state and national cases. The international arena is just so much more complicated, so I don't think this generalizes quite perfectly to most forms of geoengineering. One other thing is that I do take a technocratic approach in the sense that I evaluate all of these decisions based on whether or not they are effective, scientifically and economically effective. This overlooks factors that I think most people agree are important to politics, stuff like political participation, whether or not people participated in this decision-making process. My framework just doesn't really touch on that, but I think someone more thoughtful might be able to. And finally, the really big open question that I see being raised here is, what should we do with this? We are going to need, potentially going to need to build institutions to govern geoengineering and weather modification. And I think my case studies create a scaffolding for diagnosing these cases. They sort of explain what's happening descriptively, but creating a prescription is a much more complicated task, and one that I would have loved to do, but really did not have the time. And I hope that someone does answer that question before it becomes time to make those tough decisions. Thanks, and I'd love to take your questions.
Thank you, Laura. We have, I'm going to say, time for one.
Sorry.
Because we have to move on about 1 minute. So anyone have a question for Laura? Yeah, Isadora.
Okay. I have a question about the role of private companies in weather modification. You talk a lot about government, and I think obviously that's a really big part of this, and even just a regulatory sense. But I guess there's nothing really stopping a company from just doing their own thing as well. And so I was wondering like what the literature says about private corporations in their role in weather modification, and what you view as kind of like some of the competing interests that like generally like anyone undertaking a weather modification project might be looking to achieve.
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. If you're interested, so as regarding geoengineering, there is so much literature about what's called the rogue actor problem. This is like that dystopia in which some billionaire decides they want to geoengineer and it's cheap enough that they just can do it themselves. And people are all over the place in terms of whether that's likely, whether there are incentives to do that or whether really they have no reason to. I think my big thought on this question is that I like to draw a parallel to AI. Right now, we just saw OpenAI released, ChatGPT released by the company OpenAI, but OpenAI was founded, to prevent artificial generalized intelligence. It was founded to prevent exactly the kind of technology that it ended up producing. And so to me, I see that as the big takeaway that, and UChicago recently hired David Keith, a prominent geoengineering advocate. To me, talking about private companies, I see that as the most likely route forward, that we're actually going to like talk our way into a geoengineered world, just, through the discourse, that the discourse itself is a driver of this like atmospheric history.
We started a little late. Do you think okay, great. Let's say thanks to Laura. Thank you. Okay, great. And next we'll welcome up Zoe on her presentation, Grave Dispositions, Implementing Alternative Methods of Burial in the US.
Oh, spoilers. Where's the, okay, cool. Wait, where's the, fantastic. Oh, actually, I'm gonna grab my phone. So all right. So hi, I'm Zoe. And my thesis, I wrote about green burial, and specifically the barriers to implementing these different processes in the US. So just a little bit of background before we get into it. Disposition categorically refers to the process with which we dispose of a body, the different processes, postmortem care. So the ones that are relevant for this thesis are embalming and cremation, which are the two most popular forms of disposition in the United States. Embalming is the process of draining the corpse of blood, filling it with embalming fluid. This was popularized during the Civil War as a means of transporting bodies across long distances without them decomposing. Cremation has been used worldwide for thousands of years. In this context, we're referring to flame cremation, which is the process of using flames and heat to reduce a body to bone fragments, which are then pulverized and returned to the family. Then we have green burial, also referred to as natural or simple burial. That's burying the corpse with as little interference as possible to the decomposition process, which means it typically abides by like 3 tenets, which is no embalming, no concrete vault in the grave, as well as a outside container that is biodegradable. So that's typically like a simple untreated wood casket or a shroud. What's important to note as well with green burial is that this is not a new process. In its current iteration, as like denoted as green, is relatively new, but simple burials have been used within the Jewish community, Muslim community, other indigenous groups for thousands of years. Lastly, alkaline hydrolysis is the reduction of human remains through alkaline chemicals, heat, agitation, and pressure. Produces a similar result to flame-based cremation. You get the pulverized bone fragments. Then we have natural organic reduction, which is the use of traditional composting methods to reduce the corpse of bone fragments in soil. This is also referred to as human composting. These last two methods of disposition are more topical now. They're in the media a bit more because they've been the subject of legalization in different states. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to refer to them as alternative methods of disposition, just because there is some contention as to the green nature of these processes. So my overall research question was just, what are the barriers to successful implementation of these methods of disposition? So looking within the industry, looking within the policy, looking within consumers, as like what's facilitating and what's kind of halting these measures. This led me to this rather wordy sum up of my thesis, which is that entrenched cultural concepts of death in conjunction with tensions within the green burial movement, as well as improper regulation, have kind of challenged this successful implementation. In other words, our cultural norms, our perceptions of death, what we think of the corpse, has kind of worked in concert with ideological divides within the green death movement, within the green burial movement, and in some ways been reflected in improper zoning and regulation for a lot of these processes. So to start, I really focused my research through the lens of these 4 concepts of the corpse. So a little background, the sacred corpse is the idea that the corpse is something that is inherently deserving of dignity through religious rites typically. And that's been the norm for, I would say, again, like thousands of years. We move on to the medicalized, also known as funeralized corpse, which is the notion that the corpse is something that is to be handled strictly by professionals. So in this case, it's funeral home workers, it's healthcare workers. This was really popularized with embalming, and again with like the Civil War, we've seen a slow growth in this mindset. Next, we have the contaminated corpse, the idea that the corpse is inherently unclean, it's disease-ridden. Oh my God, it's something that we have to destroy, right? Because it's a social ill. This kind of goes hand in hand with cremation, and also with the AIDS crisis, really saw a increase, I think, in this perception of the corpse, right? That we just have to dispose of it as quickly as possible. And then lastly, there's the eco-corpse, which is the idea that the corpse is a nutritive entity. It's not just something that we take care of. The corpse takes care of us, right? We return it to the soil, it feeds the soil, and in return feeds us. So with this last one is really where we see green burial become apparent as this idea of this like holistic approach to death. But with medicalization and contamination, these 2 concepts actually work in concert with each other to become something that I and a few other scholars refer to as the professionalized corpse. So what this kind of 5th concept or joint concept does is focus on the idea of this movement displacing familial authority over the corpse and your own autonomy, right? Because before a lot of these processes became mainstream, the norm was that you would take care of the corpse within your house, like you would take care of your family members. And now all of a sudden there is this like commodification and industrialization of death. Any of you who have ever planned a funeral or been a part of a funeral know the hefty price tag that comes along with that, know the accessories that come along with that. So that's what we really see with the professionalized corpse. So with the newer processes and where they're situated, at least within respect to my thesis, I see alkaline hydrolysis and natural organic reduction as sitting between professionalization and the eco-corpse, right? Because they espouse a lot of the ideas that go along with these environmentally like oriented beliefs. It's nutritive, right? Like we're making it into soil, you can put it in your garden, you can have potting parties and plant your loved ones with seeds, right? But at the same time, these are highly professional processes. You cannot do this in your backyard, right? You're not going to compost somebody in your compost bins. And so what that does is it kind of speaks to people's environmental consciousness, but maintains professional authority over the corpse and still seeks to kind of displace that familial authority. So this leads into my methodology. I really wanted to look into, especially with these newer processes, like how are they situated? Not a lot of current literature really looks at the practical applications of these tensions in terms of how are we balancing, the traditional funeral industry's desire to maintain professional authority with kind of the consumer desire to have closeness and proximity to the corpse and to kind of conduct more green processes upon it. So with my methodology, I did a lot of cold outreach, a lot of LinkedIn, a lot of emailing people and having me reach out to their friends. Everybody in this industry is very close with each other. And then I primarily interviewed death care workers and conducted just qualitative analysis, nothing fancy. These are the people I interviewed, largely people who work within green burial, although a few of them work with either cemetery management companies as well as cremation associations. Tried to get a broad spectrum of people. This was mainly conducted over winter quarter, so December, January, February, which leads into my findings. So I separated these into 4 thematic sections to really try to distill what are the different factors kind of impacting this implementation. So firstly, just looking at misconceptions, the general consensus is that people are just not aware of what their options are. People think, as outlined with the first quote, that there is some sort of funeral police that's going to come get them if they don't, embalm people and put them in a vault and then bury them the traditional way or traditional circa past 100 years. And also that, we see the contaminated corpse come up again, and that people think that if you don't have a vault or don't have some synthetic massive casket, that the body's contaminants are going to leach into the soil and infect the community. So there's a lot of misconceptions there that are tied to those 2 professionalized corpse concepts, which leads into the next section, which is just looking at public response. So how are these misconceptions informing people's responses to these alternative methods of disposition? And surprisingly, based off of those misconceptions, consumer feedback is largely positive, which does speak to the fact that there is a hurdle in terms of information. But once it's crossed, people are generally very receptive to these processes, be it for the environmental benefits or the perceived gentle nature of the style of death care, as outlined in the second quote. People kind of think of it as being in the womb, at least with alkaline hydrolysis. That's a lot of the association people have, this idea that it's more gentler than flame based cremation, which I think is surprising given the just kind of rampant misconceptions that we see. So moving on to just switching gears a bit, legalization and implementation. Alkaline hydrolysis and natural organic reduction are often legalized under an expanded definition of cremation due to the fact that all 3 of these processes reduce the body to bone fragments, which, while from a standpoint of just pushing things through to get legalized is beneficial, from a regulatory standpoint, it poses a lot of concerns because these are fundamentally different processes. Essentially, especially with alkaline hydrolysis, for instance, where it's being zoned for things that are flame-based cremation, but alkaline hydrolysis has issues in terms of wastewater, in terms of a bunch of other things that are not involved in flame-based cremation, which also poses standardization issues. People will talk about how with natural organic reduction, you're getting different amounts of soil from different companies for similar sized people. So there's a lot of issues with standardization, which flow into one of the next concerns, which is within the green death community, there is, I would say, a pretty sharp divide in perception of these processes. So we have some people who are concerned that these are not as green as they say they are, right? So with alkaline hydrolysis and natural organic reduction, you're still using fossil fuels. You still need to ship in stuff to compost people. You still need to run a machine to reduce somebody to bone fragments, as well as the fact that these are reductive or incomplete processes like cremation, in that you still have secondary remains to contend with, versus with green burial, you put somebody in the ground, that's, there's no more after that. But on the other side of it, there are people who see it as just a greener version of existing processes and thus kind of accept it within the community. As the second quote outlines, she's if people come to me to talk about green burial and they end up doing water cremation, it's still better for the planet. So, I'm for it. Which is also in line with other people who work within green burial who have accepted the fact that you're not going to always have a perfect green burial, right? So even if you're just doing that simple natural process, people want to bury their loved ones in certain clothes or with certain accessories or cherished items, which aren't going to decompose, which are not going to necessarily be as green as just burying somebody in a shroud, but they have to balance what the mourners want with what the green process is, often siding with the mourners. So there is still, I think, a tension that exists even on that smaller level, which is just kind of echoed up through with this new debate about alternative methods of disposition. So in terms of my conclusions and next steps, I think broadly just informed regulation. A lot of these problems come from the fact that lawmakers, policymakers are not informed about these processes, or just have a lack of access or lack of communication with promoters of these different processes. So some people that I spoke to, Dean Fisher, who is one of the biggest starters and promoters of alkaline hydrolysis in the United States, talks about how a lot of his work now is just working with policymakers so that they understand what it is that they're regulating, instead of just sliding it in under existing loopholes and definitions. The next is just education. Quite simply, a lot of people just don't know what's available to them. They don't know that they're allowed to say wash their loved one's hair, or that they don't have to be buried with a casket, and that that's private cemetery regulation, not state regulation. So there's just a lack of access to education, in part because of the strong social taboos surrounding talking about death and dying. A lot of green burial requires forethought. You have to know that that's what you want in order to be buried that way. Otherwise, you're kind of flung down that industrialized pipeline. Lastly, communal death, which is pretty broad and probably could be several books in and of itself. But a large amount of people I interviewed discussed how their work was not just processing a body, but processing people's grief. People feel very isolated and alone. People don't know what their options are. There's a lack of communal support. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with education, in that in order for deaths to be sustainable, they have to be demystified. People have to be able to talk about them and grieve communally, and also have communal support for these different processes. Which, yeah. If anybody has any questions.
Great. I think we have about 4 minutes, so maybe 2 questions for Zoe. We'll start.
Thank you, Zoe. This is a loaded question, so I apologize.
It's okay.
But did you come across in your research people burying bodies incorrectly? And if so, what happens, and what are the policies in terms of punishment or enforcement to stop that from happening, whatever that might look like?
I will admit that was not my area of focus. But yeah, so I don't know exactly, but I assume it probably has something to do with corpse abuse, grave desecration, and the laws we have surrounding that. So.
Thank you.
Hi, Jordan.
Sorry, did you just run over there before?
I guess I was wondering, with respect to the legislation and movements around that, I guess first is it handled in a state, what level of government legislates on burials and such? And if so, is there I would assume if that's quite local, it complicates things quite gravely, especially with the just differences in the environment around the United States, and how the actual where you are, if you are doing green burial, does the location have a big effect on that?
Yeah, so what we see now is that legalization for these different processes happen on a state level, right? So I'm not going to remember all of them, but right now we have California, Washington, Oregon. I think New York just passed it. Colorado, that all that have human composting, natural organic reduction, that's currently legalized. So with alternative methods of disposition, it really comes down to where you are. And with the regulatory issues, even in states that say have legalized alkaline hydrolysis, a good amount don't have it actually implemented because of those zoning issues and those improper regulation. But then even on a municipal level, or even on a level of just the cemetery, everybody kind of has different rules. So some cemeteries require you to have a vault because it makes it easier for them to mow the lawn afterwards. It's purely aesthetic. So it is complicated, I guess, by the state that you live in, but even there in terms of your local community, your local government, and what's the requirement there.
One more question.
Thanks, Zoe. That was great. You alluded to this, and I know it's in your thesis, but I'm wondering if you can talk more about there's a significant sort of cultural aspect to burial and how that sort of influences uptake of different methods or of acceptance of green burials or the other alternative approaches?
Yeah, I think it comes down to people's almost like not historical knowledge, right? But a lot of the processes that we view as traditional are fairly new, but they're just what's accepted or what people know about. So with embalming, people talk about like, oh, that's our family tradition, like we embalm or whatever, but that's a fairly recent process. So it's kind of, I think, on a familial level, as well as like you will see with like certain religious communities, as I alluded to before, practice what would be considered green or natural burial because that's within like the cultural context. But even with cremation, operates on similar ways or embalming. So I think certainly people's cultural frameworks impact how they perceive these different things, whether they perceive it as dirty, whether they perceive it as something that's unsafe. Like just from my personal experience within the Jewish community, there is a culture of washing the body. That's our burial process. We wash the body, we prepare it, we sit with it until burial. So some, I think, cultural groups facilitate that kind of proximity and shrinking of the cultural distance in a way that the overarching social kind of status quo doesn't. I don't know if that answers your question.
All right, let's say thank you to Zoe. And next we'll welcome up Joe for his presentation, Visualizing the Acceleration of Rare Earth Elements Mining in Kachin, Myanmar, a Polyspectral Spatial Database.
A time or two. Cool. Okay. So, hello everyone. I'm going to be talking a little about my thesis research today on visualizing the cost of renewable energy, specifically focusing on rare earth elements mining in Myanmar. Oh.
This should be on. Okay.
Wonderful. Okay. I have a lovely graph that's essentially the same as Laura's earlier, except a little bit more grim. This one's from the IPCC 2022 report, I'm pretty sure. And it shows you kind of the current trend of if implemented policies and even planned implemented policies are actually fully implemented, that still will not curb runaway climate change and global warming. Here you see greenhouse gas emissions as a concentration versus time. And we see that really there are significant implementations that need to occur if warming is going to be curbed to either 2 degrees or below 1.5 degrees. And that we are not at all on that path right now. And so really what that means here is that the quantity of green energy technologies that are going to be implemented are going to exponentially increase in the coming years, which is interesting in that I've seen that there's this narrative of sacrifice that used to be applied to a lot of extraction, whether that be through fossil fuels, colonialism, resource extraction of all types, that for the, I say with hefty quotes, greater good, that things are justified. And because of the urgency of climate change, there's this interesting remapping on those previous narratives of extraction and sacrifice onto the renewable transition. And so in this thesis, I really wanted to interrogate those narratives and those ideas. And specifically, the way I did so is looking at rare earth elements extraction in Myanmar. So some background on rare earth elements. They're kind of this big chunk of the lanthanides here on the bottom, plus scandium and yttrium. They're all grouped together because they co-occur in the same ores in the earth. They're like broadly implemented across all different technologies, mainly they're in a lot of consumer electronics, and notably here a lot of renewable energy technologies. Specifically, they are integral in making wind technology work, as well as electric vehicles and low-cost lighting. All of those things are going to, again, similar to other things, exponentially expand over the coming years. And so the role of rare earth elements are already important and only going to be increasing in the future. I think one notable thing to mention is that rare earth elements is a huge misnomer. In fact, they are very, very common and abundant in the crust. However, there's like many other extractive processes, really an economic argument for their rarity, that it is rare they occur in high enough concentrations for their extraction to be profitable, which I think is a notable aspect of this research. So kind of looking at rare earth elements from the past to the present, we see this pretty notable uptick, especially in the past decade for rare earth elements. And again, that really corresponds to the increase of their demand in consumer electronics as well as renewable energy technologies. But even before then, there was a steady demand. And this graph is also broken up by country of origin. And you see in red are rare earth elements extracted from China, which really make up a majority of the global supply. And that's due to kind of a confluence of semi-complicated geopolitical factors. But really simply, essentially, there was kind of a lack of investment in rare earth elements technology by other countries, with the simultaneous investment from China that was partly caused by natural abundance, but also a little bit more complicated than that. But something to know is that even currently, when rare earth elements are extracted from other sites around the world, almost all of that is sent into China for processing due to the really large gap in processing methods between China and the rest of the world. And so one other important thing you can see in this graph is that in orange above China, you see the contributions from Myanmar, which kind of only emerged from 2015, 2016, but have greatly expanded in the past couple of years, notably without the pandemic, because that caused border issues. But that is kind of an interesting moment and perhaps not fully well represented in this graph because the numbers there are unclear. But I was curious in that rise and kind of what was behind that. Furthermore, looking at rare earth elements from the present to the future, I mentioned there'd be this exponential increase. This is pretty much, there are many different graphs and scholarship around this with predictive methods on how many rare earth elements we're going to need in the future, but they all look very similar to this, where there's this really large increase, like kind of like a tripling per year in some cases. But regardless, there's a large increase in the amount of rare earth elements that will be needed to sustain a renewable transition in the future. So specifically more about the extraction methods of rare earth elements, they're separated into two groups, heavy rare earth elements and light rare earth elements. Heavy rare earth elements are much more rare and only occur in this one specific type of mineral called ion absorption clays, where instead of being chemically incorporated into a rock, instead they're just adsorbed onto clay over time. And so the mining methods of these differ dramatically from kind of the traditional strip mining, surface mining approaches of light rare earth elements. Here, as you can see on the right, large holes are drilled into the surface of the earth and leaching fluid is pumped into those holes and then collected in leaching pools, as you see on the left. And so if this is done correctly, the rare earth elements leach into the leaching fluid and then are collected and processed, and can successfully be collected with minimal waste. However, in reality, this mining is often unregulated or at least doesn't follow mining regulations. And so there's really a massive potential for large scale contamination in this processes. The leaching fluid is like a deeply caustic substance. And additionally, these elements co-occur with a lot of radioactive elements as well, notably thorium. And so the wastewater here is incredibly acidic as well as radioactive. And so improper management of this wastewater has the potential for wide-scale environmental and human disaster. Up until 2016, all pretty much of the heavy rare earth elements around the world were mined in the south of China. And we saw this really unfortunate proliferation of illegal mining that caused wide-scale environmental disaster. And then in 2016, this was really cracked down upon, perhaps less for the environmental issues and more for a centralization of trade in China. But notably, a lot of rare earth element mining companies were consolidated into a single state-owned company, as well as a lot of these illegal operations were cracked down upon. But instead of this cessation and I say with hefty quotes, sustainable implementation of this type of mining, instead, really these same companies turned their eyes towards Myanmar and began extracting from there. And so that process is identified, like people understand that it's happening, but the true scale of that is unclear, especially because when the rare earth element, like raw ore, is going between Myanmar and China, there are all these kind of small processes that really obscure the origins of these elements. And like that whole supply chain is really complicated. And so I wanted to kind of gain more insight into that and look at the exponential growth or perhaps lack thereof over time from 2016 to the present. So the way I did that is by looking at satellite data. I was not able to conduct field studies here, and it's a very inaccessible region in general, especially with the pandemic. And so I wanted to look at how satellite data could be used to kind of gain a remote window into human rights and environmental abuses such as this. However, there are a ton of issues inherent to satellite data. One more practically is that it's very difficult to gain high resolution satellite data. So one of the only sources that was accessible to me, this is considered very high resolution, looks like this. You saw earlier what those kind of large pools looked like, but with this like high resolution satellite data, this is what those pools look like. And so it's very difficult to interpret satellite data with the human eye. And in addition, one large benefit of satellite data is that you have high temporal resolution. So this data set I'm drawing from has either every day or every other day of the same region, which is really amazing and allows you this kind of precise control and understanding of the evolution of these processes over time. However, analyzing such a high volume of data is provides a really impossible barrier to overcome. And so implementing more machine learning techniques here is one way of taking advantage of such data, both solving the resolution issues and also that high spatial resolution of the data. So as kind of a trial run for these types of techniques and implementing this workflow, I looked at this region around the Pang War region of Myanmar, which is on the China-Myanmar border. And I chose this large square because it has a kind of unusually high concentration of rare earth elements infrastructure that I just saw from overhead view. And so I thought that high density would allow these techniques to be tested kind of as maximally as possible and really allow most data points here. So the first kind of method towards creating such an algorithm is by creating this training data set where I take known rare earth element sites and then I label them for the data set, just visually like this. And then next, because a kind of large barrier here is that the amount of training data is very small. And with machine learning algorithms like this, you want as large a training data set as possible. So in order to compensate for some of those issues, I performed a series of transformations on that data. Sorry for the sideways nature, it didn't really fit vertically, but essentially I scaled, mirrored, flipped, provided a bunch of optical transformations on these images to kind of increase the diversity with a smaller starting data set. And after those were tiled, they kind of look like this, where you see here that in each individual image, they're kind of multiple smaller images that are tiled in different ways and transformed in order to allow the algorithm to kind of look at more instances of the same types of images. So next, the actual neural network was trained, which I admit I'm not a computer science person. I don't have a huge background in this, but to explain really simply, essentially in such a neural network, there are all of these variables the neural network is looking for, and it takes each of those variables and convolutes them down to kind of a single dimension and then re-extracts the data back out. And that happens through this backbone, neck, and head of the head of the neural network. So next are supposed to be 2 slides showing you the success of the training of the network, which didn't make it into this presentation. So with this handy laser pointer, I'm going to create the graphs for you now. Wow. So notably, there are a bunch of different variables that you can look at to gauge the success of a training of such an algorithm. One important one is the mean average precision, which essentially shows you both how many of the sites you identified, but also how accurately you identified them. And so this AI algorithm was trained over 1,000 different epochs. So essentially it took the same data and trained on it 1,000 times. And over time, you see kind of a data set that looks like this, where there's this kind of up and down, but slow increase in precision. And a nice thing about this is that we can just identify the highest possible point, which isn't necessarily the 1,000th epoch, and take that data as the best data. And so in this case, it ended up being the 914th epoch. Another important set of data that's important to think about are the precision and recall of the algorithm. So recall here is of the total number of sites, how many were correctly identified? So how many were missed out upon versus identified? And then the precision is of those sites that were identified, how many were correctly identified versus incorrectly identified? And both of those are controlled by a third variable, which is the confidence. So essentially, how confident does the algorithm have to be in a guess before it considers it true? And so we have 2 graphs essentially of the recall versus confidence and the precision versus confidence. And in the recall, we see something that looks like this, where the higher the confidence you get, the lower the recall, because it has to be more certain for it to identify something, so it misses out. However, with the precision, it's the opposite, where the more confident you are, the higher the precision is. So there's this trade-off between the two, and there were kind of these 2 local maxima for this region at 0.5 and 0.12. And in a slightly more complicated analysis, mathematically, it was determined that 0.12 is optimal for this algorithm. So moving on to actually applying the data set. So now it's been trained, we've identified the parameters that maximize its efficacy, and then it was applied to the actual data of the region. So I took quarterly data. Again, I had literally every day if I wanted it, but just as a test of this type of algorithm, I did every quarter. Except notably not the summer. During the summer, there's rain almost every single day. And so cloud cover is a huge barrier to satellite data as well. And there really just don't exist cloudless images of the region during the summer. And so I looked at the 1st and 4th quarters from 2016 to 2022. And this is kind of a summation of all of the sites that were identified and then what percentage of those were correctly identified. Notably, and lovely you can see in the black trend line, there is this exponential increase over time, which is what was expected. But there are also kind of some notable hurdles that the algorithm encountered. You can see in 2017 in the first quarter, there's this large spike of misidentified data. Unfortunately, that's due to cloud cover. So for some reason in 2017 in the winter, there were a lot of clouds. And so there were no totally cloudless images. And even really small clouds can be misinterpreted as mining sites. And so that's what caused that kind of large area of incorrectly identified materials. But other than that, the algorithm is actually quite good, like surprisingly so for such a rudimentary kind of first go at this with a small training data set, which is really exciting. So in conclusion, we created this like highly flexible framework to apply image recognition to analyze high volume spatial data. And in addition, like what's really important about this is that using remotely sensed data like this allows us access into remote environmental and human rights abuses, and when fieldwork isn't possible. And finally, a huge limitation of this model is that it really requires a high volume of training data, which I wasn't able to apply it, and it really limits its application towards other potential remotely sensed applications. So further optimization is required in order to take a smaller training data set and extract high quality information from it. And then finally, in this specific case study, we were able to identify an exponential increase of leaching pools in the Panghwa region from 2016 to 2022. And then just very quickly, a fast but like deep and eternal thank you to Alexander, who is like a just truly wonderful mentor and has been like integral in me understanding evolving this project, and many times it was a total mess, and the fact that it coalesced into anything is almost entirely his doing. And then also Marshall Kramer gave me some really valuable information on this region from his studies there, and the whole thesis colloquium, notably Topher and Sabina, very same idea. This project was nothing at many times and now it is something, and that is highly to your guys' credit. So thank you very much.
Joe. Minutes for questions, maybe 2 to start.
This wonderful picture,
This might be a bit like CS oriented, so if it's out of your wheelhouse, just let me know. But I was wondering, since you have the daily access of these images, was there any thought of using that to buttress your training data set?
Totally. This was just like solely a function of lack of time, but that definitely is a future path forward. And I think probably one of the best ways of increasing here. The problem is that, so even if we have the same place every day, it will look different every day, but fundamentally will be very similar. And so part of it is just a function of literally needing to scale up geographically. But that definitely would help. I think a big issue that, as you can see in general, the farther you go back in time, the worse it gets at identifying things. And part of that is just that these satellites were changing over time. And so like literally when you look at them, they look differently. In fact, you can see that the fourth quarter of 2022 is totally absent here, even though I had that data at the time of this thesis. But that's because it just like was totally different. In fact, it was much better, which gives me hope that future data will be more analyzable, because it was just far more clear the contrast was better. And that was without any like processing. They just changed what satellites they were using. And so that's a good thing in that it will provide better information in the future, but it's tough because it makes back analyzing data difficult with the current data, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Laura.
Thanks. So you mentioned that in your conclusion that mining like increased exponentially in the region of interest. I'm just curious how that compares to what you were expecting, or like what is already known about the topic.
Yeah, that definitely aligns with expectation. I was hoping to provide more quantitative data to kind of bolster the qualitative data. One notable thing here is that it's very hard to report on these things because there's kind of high worker censorship, both in terms of local Myanmar workers and kind of imported Chinese workers. It's like, again, like illegal is the wrong word, because there actually like aren't laws regulating it. Something that I wasn't able to touch on in this presentation, but something that's really integrally involved with this is that there's been this really a long time region of high political instability for Myanmar, but specifically in this region, there were 2 coups that kind of dramatically changed what regulation in the government looked like. And even before then, this region is like essentially completely managed by a warlord. And that warlord's relationship between The government has changed depending on like who was in power in the government, but kind of all of that really complicates this and makes it so reporting in that region is really difficult. And so while there have been studies, in fact, some of which use satellite data showing there has been this growth, it's been really hard to actually ascribe quantitative numbers to that. And so quantitation isn't everything, but I think that this study was an effort in order to provide more concrete data for this specific instance and also other instances like it, where we understand something is happening, but don't have a great idea on actually what is happening and the scope of it.
Since you noticed that like the number of sites kind of increased at the same rate as the sort of economic footprint of the industry, do you think that that provides evidence that the processes itself were not gaining in efficiency, but rather just in scale during this period?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would struggle to make a very firm claim around that, but I imagine, so when you actually see those leaching pools, it kind of is clear what techniques they're using, which is a very rudimentary version. Essentially, they're just putting everything in a big pool and then like chucking things into it, and then evaporating all the water off and letting it. So I think in that way, it is semi-clear that there are no efficiency increases. This is like a very low cost operation. But I think that this type of data, one thing that it really struggles with is providing more intricate details like that, where I can just like by eye inspect what's going on, but especially in a machine learning context, like it really provides no information on what type of extraction is actually occurring, only the fact that there is extraction occurring, which is a large weakness. Thanks.
All right, let's thank Joe for his presentation. Great, and next we have Meghan Hendrix, who we can welcome to the stage. Meghan's thesis is titled Oil Change, Evaluating Fossil Fuel Divestment Campaigns and Commitments at U.S. Higher Education Institutions.
Cool. Can you all hear me okay? Awesome. I'm just going to set a timer real quick. Awesome. Okay. I'm Meghan. I hope you all are doing well. And I'm excited to be talking with you all today about my thesis, which evaluates fossil fuel divestment campaigns and commitments at U.S. higher education institutions. And it's kind of exciting that I'm going right after Joe. As you can see, Joe's right here on the main page. So for my thesis, I really want to evaluate kind of this disjointedness between campaigns and commitments at higher education institutions, which was based on my own experience with UChicago's fossil fuel divestment campaign. I also kind of wanted to look at fossil fuel divestment in general, as I found it to be kind of a nebulous topic, and I was hoping this could elucidate some general themes as to why people do it and what they're hoping to get out of it. So for this, I synthesized two key questions. So I wanted to look at the institutions that have made commitments to divest from fossil fuels and see what they credited as playing a role in making their decision. In addition to this, I wanted to see if commonalities existed between the rhetoric and the tactics that were used by the campaigns and what was responded with by the institutions later on. And so with this, I think the font actually changed a little bit on this PowerPoint, but basically what I ended up looking at was the peer institutions of the University of Chicago, so that I could have the central case study of this university to really ground my research, and also so I could look at these institutions that often play a role in being influential amongst the landscape more in general, because the peers of UChicago are the schools that are often selective, and they often have quite large endowments. So this in turn can sometimes impact the investment management of other institutions, or at least it seems that way based on media attention. So these questions were really what grounded my research. But to start things out, I just want to give a brief overview of what things are like at the University of Chicago, as I believe this context is helpful for people when learning about divestment. So basically, fossil fuel divestment campaigns started at UChicago in around 2011, and this came after students were advocating for socially responsible investing of the university's endowment. So the endowment is a big pool of money, and it's kind of shifted in its size over the time of UChicago. Currently, it sits around $10.3 billion. But basically, there was a student government referendum of students who wanted an ethical oversight committee that included committee members, students, and faculty to look over it. So this referendum passed. However, not too much came out of it. So ultimately, they decided to continue pushing on, and a specific campaign called the UChicago Climate Action Network formed. And so they started to do things that were typical among other campaigns at institutions. So they started to do protests, and they started to have a report. And so notably in 2014, they created a report that gave both financial and moral reasons for divestment, and they hosted a big protest, and then they tried to hand it off to President Zimmer, who wasn't available to pick it up, but it got to him. And he basically said that he found divestment to be pretty unlikely. He didn't think UChicago would do it due to this thing called the Calvin Report, which is basically a report that guides investment decisions and other decisions by the university that basically says they don't want to take a political stance. And this was in light of prior student activism at the university, specifically around like the Vietnam and Korean War. And so nevertheless, students pushed on, and there was a lot of campus engagement, specifically in the year 2015. And so there were protests, including going by the Booth School of Business and walking backwards to kind of say that the university was going backwards, specifically on commitments they had made to like meet and engage with students. And then additional tactics were tried. Students tried to engage with the faculty. So the University Faculty Senate decided to discuss divestment. And this was something where there's a lot of open engagement, but not too much came out of it. There's no like formal resolution for this end. However, there was an open letter that 250 faculty members signed on to, which ended up getting attention in The Guardian. However, around 2016, things started to get a little bit more ambiguous. So the Climate Action Network wasn't the main thing organizing for divestment at this point. There started to be a lot of other activism efforts on campus, particularly around divestment from Israel. And so that ended up being the big thing that comes up in a lot of news articles from around that time. Divestment was briefly mentioned in some protests, including in 2018, when people were protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline. There's also brief mentions of iron, which basically did a big protest in 2016 that advocated for both divestment and then also for fair wages for workers, and also some changes to the UCPD and student disability services. And then in 2020, there was some stuff on basically trying to release the endowment. And so this was pioneered by a few other student organizing groups, but wasn't explicitly about fossil fuel divestment. However, in the fall of 2021, the fossil fuel divestment campaign was restarted through the Environmental Justice Task Force. And so that lands us to where we are today. And so this is kind of what informed my interest in the thesis work, was helping out with things such as like the graphic design for things like posters and stickers, some of which you might have seen. And so I was kind of wondering like what types of arguments were we trying to invoke here? And so I noticed in a lot of them, there were kind of these like moral arguments or arguments about the future. So this idea of like saving the earth or investing in our future. And so some of this came from other campaigns or other sort of divestment efforts at different institutions. But yeah, I was just kind of curious about what was informing kind of my logic around divestment and what was informing the other people here. And so I was kind of curious more broadly if there was any sort of thing that kind of related the ultimate commitments and implications from the schools to the tactics and demands of the campaigns. And so ultimately what I find is that there are some underlying arguments that say the same. There are a lot of moral arguments around divestment. However, at the same time, when schools ultimately make commitments, they often don't cite like the activism of students. Like they don't cite like big disruptive demonstrations or protests generally, although there are a few exceptions. They more often cite things like engagement and kind of these slower routes. So often like rather than having these protests that really cite like focus on moral things or like legal complaints that talk about the financial element, it often goes down to this sort of moral argument around the decision to divest. Just to give some background, Swarthmore College is often cited as the first school to have a fossil fuel divestment campaign, which kind of came through this like moral and environmental justice lens. So they really were focusing on mountaintop removal mining, which was occurring in the community around Swarthmore. And so this was something where they were ultimately successful, and it kind of kickstarted campaigns around the country and around the world. And this was also kind of bolstered by Bill McKibben, who's a notable climate journalist and activist, who was doing this like do the math tour, where he went around and he basically tried to say that like fossil fuel divestment is something that's important and also might be financially prudent for investors because of something called stranded asset risk, where it's possible as regulations are introduced that investing in fossil fuel companies won't be profitable and that assets will just be stranded. But basically hundreds of campaigns ended up happening around the world, and some of them were successful. So as of now, there are nearly 1,600 institutions that have divested. And according to this one commitments database that's kind of pivotal in this kind of research, the Fossil Fuel Divestment Commitment commitments database, the assets under management in total for all of these institutions is around $40 trillion. So they consider this to be a pretty big effort. And so when I saw this, though, I kind of had some questions about, okay, what is a fossil fuel company and what does it look like for an institution to divest from them? And this is something where it gets a little bit complicated. So a fossil fuel company, is it just something that's directly involved with oil and gas? Or is it something that like just kind of supports these industries? When people say they're divesting, what does that look like? And so for a brief overview on that, so like often in these contexts, people are referring to the top 200 oil and gas companies based on reserve size, or at least the commitments database, that's kind of what they use as their benchmark. And then so what it looks like for a university to divest from them is basically pulling out of both direct and indirect holdings. So like direct holdings are like if you're directly invested in, say, like BP, but an indirect holding would be if you have a mutual fund, for instance, that has exposure to BP. However, this can get a little bit complex where when people say they're fully divesting, this often means that they have to work with fund managers across different like asset management firms. It can often be a process to like pull out. There may be transaction costs involved. And so this is something where it can become a little bit blurred in terms of the actual implementation of fossil fuel divestment commitments in terms of whether they're actually fully divesting. And I think that's something that'll be really exciting for future research. But to give a brief overview of like the landscape of divestment campaigns, so the majority of commitments made have kind of been full commitments, so both direct and indirect. However, there are some are partial, which might be only direct investments in the fossil fuel companies, or it might be a specific type, such as like only thermal coal. And then there are some that are also it's like there's one that's like coal only, and then there's one that's like coal and tar sands, and then there's a couple that are fossil free. And so the fossil free designation under the commitments database are the ones that have been successful in like fully implementing a divestment from fossil fuels. However, this is something that like, again, like there might be more than this, but they may not have publicly disclosed it because both the commitments database and my own research kind of just went off of what was publicly available online. So my literature review basically looked at the other main researchers that have looked at divestment campaigns, some of which were former people involved with campaigns. And so a lot of this was basically looking at rhetorical arguments around divestment. And so some had previously in 2014 or 2015, as campaigns were starting to come out, kind of look at the main tactics they used and like what underlying arguments there were, and if schools had either rejected or accepted divestment proposals, what that would look like. And so there's one in particular that was an undergraduate thesis from the Claremont Consortium that was really pivotal because it sort of looked at like the first like small handful of schools that had had these campaigns and just sort of really what that back and forth looked like. And so that really informed my research. And then in addition to that, there was somebody who had basically been at Harvard as they were doing a legal complaint that was basically saying that by being invested in fossil fuels, it's an imprudent management of funds. And so he wrote a piece on that because it was not ultimately a successful complaint, but it did have some initial kind of arguments about why they thought this was the case. And ultimately, Harvard did divest from fossil fuels. So he was kind of suggesting that this could have created a sort of media attention and stigmatization that could have played a big role. In addition to this, there are some that analyze the social media presence of different campaigns. So there's one in particular that looked at the Facebook pages of different campaigns and kind of whether there's a link to climate justice in a lot of them. And so this is something where I think it's really important to consider the positionality of fossil fuel divestment campaigns because they're often at these like higher education institutions. They're often mainly just students. And so it's something where it's worth noting whether they're engaged with the community or if they're engaged with other kind of social justice or climate justice efforts. And then more broadly, I really grounded my work in this notion of critical university studies, which is kind of an emerging field over the last few years, but it really focuses on the university as this neoliberal institution and kind of the things that come along with that. So specifically this idea of militarization and then also the general increase in capital. And so in the past, a lot of this is focused on things such as the police forces around campuses, or that's focused a lot on just like the rising cost in tuition. But I think it's kind of valuable to consider the endowment because it's a major pool of funding for the university. It's what funds the operations. And so I thought it'd be cool to see just like how this potentially links in. And then I also used various things from organizational theory. So broadly for my thesis, what I ended up doing was looking at the commitment statements for 78 institutions. So I looked at the ones that were publicly available online, and to inform my thematic analysis, I did a word frequency query to see what words would come up frequently. And then to look at the University of Chicago, I basically looked at articles from the Chicago Maroon. And then to look at the peer institutions, I basically looked at data from the IPED survey, which is something from like the National Center for Education. And then with that, I basically looked at mainly news articles that were available from their like local like student run newspapers. If that wasn't available, then I would just use other local things. And so basically to give an overview for this, I saw that divestment commitments seem to be increasing at these higher education institutions, which is useful context for just kind of seeing whether some of these like large cases of divestment potentially have influenced other schools to divest, which is something where it's hard to draw a causal link there. But I think it shows that it is something worth researching, potentially if schools are going to continue divesting or making commitments to divest over time. So my finding for common themes across the commitments include basically moral reasons for divesting. And so one thing that I found really interesting was a lot of the early schools to divest were schools that were religious in their mission. And so for those, they often related it to religious teachings. And so specifically schools that were historically Catholic would often mention the Laudato Si, which is basically something that was released by Pope Francis. And he basically just said that like climate justice is really important. And later on, he actually said directly that he thought fossil fuel divestment could be something that was valuable. And then more broadly, there were a lot of arguments about investing in the future and obligations to the future. And there are also things about just like current climate and social justice obligations. They didn't often directly mention like issues in their community, but they often said more broadly like, oh, like we care about social issues and we want things to move on, which I think is also relevant with the fact that a lot of the commitments were in like 2020 or 2021 in the light of the pandemic and racial justice efforts. In addition to this, there was a lot of mentions of student and faculty engagement. And so often with this, they would mention things that like resolutions that are being passed through governance bodies or specific meetings or reports that were handed to people, but not that many mentioned activism. So there are only a few that did. There are often smaller institutions and a couple institutions in Boston. And even in those, they'd often say like, oh, like this raised our awareness to it. And then we met with students and then we had this engagement back and forth. They very rarely cited activism as being the main thing that caused them to divest, which is interesting because at a lot of the schools that ultimately did divest from fossil fuels, they did have activism efforts, which was seen in the peer institution analysis they'll talk about. And more broadly, they often talked about this notion of fiduciary duty, and so their obligation to take the money from the donors and use it in a way that keeps the operation going of the university and kind of keep their mission aligned. However, along with that, they'd go back and forth on whether fiduciary duty was being kind of further fulfilled by divesting from fossil fuels. Sometimes they would say like, oh, this is the most sustainable route, kind of invoking that notion of stranded asset risk. They'd often say that sustainable investing was successful. However, some would say like, they'd basically try and see people who are hesitant and kind of be like, oh, like even if we do divest from fossil fuels, we'll still have good returns. So it's kind of interesting to see that back and forth. And then more broadly, they'd often link it to these arguments around transparency and kind of transitioning energy transition arguments more broadly. In addition to this, I found the common tactics. And so there were often in-person demonstrations. There are also online outreach strategies. And then often basically different campaigns would work with social justice organizations on campus. And then there was a rising usage of litigation efforts, so basically creating legal complaints, which started with Harvard, but then more recently there have been a few other cases which have been coordinated by the Climate Defense Project, which is basically people working in the legal field who assist with making these complaints for free. And then so in my analysis of peer schools via Chicago, I looked at the 13 and found which ones had full, partial, or no current commitments. And so of the schools that had full commitments, what I found out from analyzing the social media and the news articles around them was that all of these schools had active campaigns that had disruptive protest and other things that often invoked moral arguments. But then ultimately in the commitment statements, these weren't mentioned. It was just mentioned as like, oh, there was like some engagement. But in addition to this, both Cornell, Harvard, and Princeton had litigation efforts that happened. And it often seemed like the commitment to divest happened shortly after those legal complaints. And then at the schools with partial or no commitments, there's similarly some like student activism and involvement at all of the schools except for Caltech. But there hadn't been just sort of like a final commitment made. And so ultimately my conclusions with this were basically that institutions care a lot about kind of the moral component of fossil fuel divestment and kind of frame it as part of aligning with their mission, but they often credit these like non-disruptive modes of engagement. However, those institutions often had like these campaigns that were active in there, and these campaigns have often stayed active afterwards, and they've been continuing trying to push their university to change, which I think raises really interesting arguments about what is most effective for creating change within a university. And so it seems like potentially these disruptive campaigns might have the power to kind of implicitly put things on the agenda for universities. However, it's hard to create a causal link on that. But ultimately, it's much to think about. It was a pretty fun time to look into this. And I just wanted to give a big thanks to everybody in the Environmental Justice Task Force and also Phoenix Sustainability Initiative. I learned a ton from these really engaged students, and also to the many people who gave advice throughout this process. This was a chaotic thesis to write, and I'm really grateful that people were always willing to give advice and just be really kind and helpful throughout the whole process. So thank you.
That's you, Ray.
Hi, Megan. Great job. As you know, we've talked about, I think this is the university was wrong in trying to apply the Calvin report to this. Are there any other universities that have tried to make a free speech argument on this?
Honestly, not really. The University of Chicago is the main one I saw. There were like one or two that were at first like, oh, like we don't want to be political, but then those ones ultimately would make commitments, which is something that I kind of talk about a little bit in my thesis, is the fact that like it does seem like it's kind of skewing in this direction. And I do kind of wonder if like if the majority of the peers of the university have made commitments to divest from fossil fuels, if it no longer becomes a political decision and more like aligning with like the landscape of what's happening currently. But yeah, I don't know. It is interesting. Like UChicago does seem like a pretty special case. Like there is just a long history of like campus activism here. And then there's been just kind of like a variety of university responses. And there's some great theses on these. Warren Wagner recently presented one that was basically just on engagement around the trauma center on the South Side and how there's both student engagement and community engagement. And I think it's something where like just the university in general, like universities as an institution can be kind of challenging to engage with. But I think UChicago in particular, yes, an interesting case. But yeah, I think I think there are potential avenues for just like continued engagement, and I'm excited to see what those are.
It is 2:25. So say thank you to Megan. We're transitioning to capstone presentations. Is that correct? Or do we have a break? Great. Let's say thanks to our 4 presenters for the panel. Thanks, everyone.